This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
It's very nice to be back here at Duke. It's been a while since I've been here, but I have a lot of friends at this institution, and it's nice to see how well they and the institution both are doing. I won't thank all the different entities and centers and lecture series that have contributed to making this possible, and only say I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about the crisis and about the dollar and about my book. So as we meet here today, the dollar is once again very much in the news, and not all that news is good. The Fed's decision to engage in a second round of quantitative easing continues to be seen by some in emerging markets in particular as an explicit attempt to debase or devalue the dollar and shift the costs of the financial crisis onto other countries. So a little over a week ago, the Brazilian finance minister made another series of statements to that effect, critical of the Fed and of its management of the dollar. Worries about inflation, whether justified or not, are clearly back. The specter of trillion-dollar budget deficits, as far as the eye can see, creates the danger, or at least worries, that the Fed will eventually feel pressure to inflate away the federal debt. Gold prices continue to scale new heights, signaling, how should one put it politely, less than full confidence in the dollar. There is good news, obviously, as well. The bright side, if you will, is that other currencies like the euro have even more serious problems. And the dollar has the exorbitant privilege that it is not only our currency, but the world's. So that last fact is what my book is fundamentally about, although it connects up to issues of global governance and it connects up to issues surrounding the crisis. My book is about the extraordinary extent to which the dollar is the world's currency, and what will happen if and when that is no longer the case. So I really need to emphasize how exceptional the role of the dollar globally is. We just had a new survey of foreign exchange transactions from the Bank for International Settlements released 2 or 3 weeks ago. The BIS does such a survey once every 3 years, and it determined that the dollar is currently used in 85%. It's on one side of fully 85% of all foreign exchange transactions worldwide. So South Korea and Chile have a free trade agreement, and Chilean wine, Montes Alpha, is the most popular wine now in South Korea. But when a South Korean importer wants to buy Montes Alpha, they buy dollars with their Korean won. 99% of all foreign exchange transactions involving won have dollars on the other side. 99%, 99.6%, if I recall the decimal point, of all foreign exchange transactions involving the Chilean peso have dollars on the other side. So when that Korean importer wants to buy Chilean wine, he buys dollars and uses the dollars to pay the Chilean export. That 85% number globally is stable, unaffected by the crisis, relative to 3 years ago or 3 years before that. The IMF a couple of months ago released its most up-to-date data for the third quarter of 2010 on the currency composition of the foreign exchange reserves of central banks and governments around the world. The dollar still accounts for 61% of the foreign exchange reserves of central banks worldwide. As I put it in the book, when Somali pirates ransom a ship, they demand that the ransom money be parachuted to them in dollars. When Iran gives President Karzai's people bags full of money. The money in question is in dollars. So the striking fact to me is how little the crisis did to affect this. This is what the then French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing meant when he referred to the dollar's exorbitant privilege, that it is the world's currency and nothing seems to change this status quo. Life is unfair is what Mr. Giscard meant. The dollar actually was one of the beneficiaries of the crisis, despite the fact that the financial crisis in question was born and bred here in the United States. When there was turbulence and volatility in international financial markets, people fled to the most liquid and reliable market in dollars. 2 weeks ago, when rumors began to abound about a change in government in Egypt, the dollar strengthened relative to other currencies. So this fact that the dollar is the world's currency, that we have this exorbitant privilege, is not actually an entirely unmixed blessing. Since foreigners need dollars to finance their international transactions, because they want to accumulate dollars as a form of insurance against unexpected financial shocks, they're willing to lend to us in order to acquire them. If we in the United States are prone to financial excesses, for example, engaging in currency real estate speculation, then they willingly give us more rope by purchasing the securities of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae or close substitutes for them. So again, I think there is, and we can talk about this more, a connection between the asymmetric role of the dollar in the international system and the nature of the financial crisis through which we have just passed. The financial crisis is, of course, history. We now, in the United States, have now learned the error of our ways. We're now saving more, but with Americans now saving more, spending less, we need a weaker exchange rate in order to be able to export more of what we produce. But we find that weaker dollar exchange rate hard to obtain because other countries have good reason to want to continue paying their currencies to the dollar. From America's point of view, this means that the dollar's exorbitant privilege is a burden as well as a blessing. Here too, there are questions about what the future may bring. This was a serious problem for the United States earlier in our history. It was a serious problem for the US in the early 1970s. Richard Nixon was famously unable to devalue the dollar against other currencies in 1971, despite his Treasury Secretary John Connally's efforts to badger and berate other governments. Nixon achieved his desired goal in the end by blowing up the then existing international monetary and financial system. So it raises the question of how these problems might be solved this time around. So in order to try to understand those issues better, I think it's necessary to ask, how did we get into this situation? The dollar achieved its current position of dominance after World War II, when America's was the only economy standing. The U.S. was not just the dominant industrial power, but it had far and away the largest and most liquid financial markets in the world. All this made it logical and indeed highly attractive for companies and central banks around the world to transact in dollars. There was no intrinsic reason why the U.S. should have accounted for the majority of the industrial production of the free world indefinitely, which was the situation in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So gradually over time, we have seen the war-torn economies of Europe and then Japan and now emerging markets begin to close the gap vis-a-vis the United States. So the world economy has become more multipolar for entirely logical reasons over time. The international monetary and financial system has not become more multipolar. So one of the ways I understand the financial crisis that we've been through is as a result of the tension between what has become, with good reason, a more balanced, a more multipolar real economy and a still peculiarly dominated international monetary system. And I will come back to that. So the question is, why does the dollar still dominate to the extent it does? The conventional answer would be the advantages of incumbency, just as incumbency is an advantage for an elected politician seeking to hold on to office. Incumbency is an advantage for the dominant international currency. So you're an importer or an exporter, you're that exporter of Chilean wine, you've got to decide in what currency to price your products. You want to avoid confusing your customers, so you price your exports in the same unit dollars that other exporters do. With everyone else quoting prices in dollars, it makes sense for you to continue to do so. With everyone else buying, selling, and holding dollars, it similarly pays to buy, sell, and hold dollars, since markets and dollar-denominated assets will be the most liquid. Everyone in the room will know that economists have a name for situations like this. This is a situation or a market characterized by network externalities, where it pays to adopt the same standard as everyone else. And it's easily demonstrated that situations featuring network externalities are also characterized by high levels of persistence. Once a standard, in this case the dollar standard, is widely adopted, it tends to become locked in. Or so it is said. So I now want to suggest that this presumption, even if it may have been valid once upon a time, is no longer valid. For example, the notion that importers, exporters, and bond underwriters will all want to use the same unit as other importers, exporters, and bond underwriters in order to avoid confusing their customers holds less weight in a world where everyone carries in their pocket a device called a smartphone, where you can compare prices denominated in different currencies in real time. Once upon a time, comparing prices in dollars and euros and Chinese renminbi may have been beyond the capacity of all but the most sophisticated traders and investors, but we live in a world where currency converter is one of the 10 most downloaded widgets at the Apple App Store. So even if it's true that the costs of switching and interchangeability were high once, this is no longer the case today. Once upon a time, it was said there was room in the world for only one operating system for personal computers. If you weren't a dedicated computer hobbyist, you had to use Windows because everybody else with whom you wanted to exchange data used Windows. With the passage of time, the technology has become more open and more flexible. Now we have not just Microsoft, but Apple, Google, Linux, all sharing this market. So I want to suggest that the same is now increasingly the case of international finance. Once upon a time, it may have been true that there was room for only one international currency, the dollar. But now, because switching and interchangeability costs have fallen, technology has moved on, there's room for several international currencies. We're heading, in other words, toward a world in which several currencies share the international stage, share the dollar's exorbitant privilege. And I want to suggest that this change is to be welcomed, not feared, that the global economy will be more stable ultimately and better performing if there's a better match between the structure of the real economy and the structure of its monetary system. The difficulty, of course, as always in the transition, being how to get from here to there. So Which international currencies specifically am I talking about? I would attach the highest probability to the three I mentioned before, the dollar, the euro, and the renminbi. So I can see, or at least I can imagine, eyebrows being raised around the room. A number of you are about to object that one or more of these currencies is not ready for prime time and won't be ready anytime soon. The problem being that you will object to different ones and ultimately all three of my candidates. So it is fair to say that pessimism is currently most pervasive about the euro. It's not clear that the crisis countries of the European periphery, now being forced to impose draconian spending cuts, can recover from their crisis without reintroducing their own currencies, so that they can then devalue and grow their exports, thereby growing their way out from under their crushing debt burdens. Keeping them in the euro area would require massive transfers from Germany, and German voters would rather abandon the euro and reintroduce the Deutschmark than agree to this, or so it is said. My view is that all this euro doom and gloom is overdone. While a Greek or Irish default certainly can't be ruled out, I think they are more likely than not. Neither can a default by the city of Los Angeles or Nassau County, New York. But just like a default by Los Angeles or Nassau County would not mean the end of the dollar, a Greek default would not mean the end of the euro. Moreover, and I'm sure we will talk about this, Greece would almost certainly make its problems worse by attempting to reintroduce the drachma. Germany, for its part, in my opinion, has too much invested in the European project to turn its back on that now, which is what abandoning the single currency would entail. In particular, German business attaches very considerable value to the euro, and I think would be prepared to accept political and economic sacrifices in order to see it survive. So what would that entail? I think strengthening the euro up to the point where questions about its survival recede and it begins to become international currency of the first rank requires Europe to complete its monetary union. So the EU has beautiful banknotes and shiny coins and a pretty good central bank, but it doesn't have the other elements of a working monetary union. And now, 11 years after the fact, it has to move forward and put those in place. It needs to strengthen its banks. It needs to shift supervision and regulation of its banking systems from the national authorities to the level of the EU, because I think having a single currency and multiple regulators is madness. Basically, we have that problem writ small in the United States. They in Europe have it in the large, with stronger French and German banks and proper bank regulation at the level of the European Union. It will then become possible for the Greeks and the Irish to restructure their debts without causing a European banking crisis. They can then move to strengthen surveillance of national economies and put the crisis behind them. Will Europe do these things? Whenever the European Union has faced a crisis before and been confronted with the decision of whether to go forward or back, it's moved forward. Jacques Delors, who knows something about these issues, said recently, Europe needs to rediscover its soul. So my best guess is that it will, and it will deepen the monetary union and deepen political integration in response to the current crisis. So much about the euro. Let me say a few words about the dollar and then about the renminbi. So someone was commenting at the lunch we had about the peculiar fact that the euro hasn't fallen dramatically against the dollar, despite this crisis through which Europe has been passing for the last year plus. And my answer to that was, this fact reflects that there are good reasons to be worried about the future of the dollar and the U.S. economy as well. So to be very brief, the problem is dysfunctional politics that continue to undermine our efforts to bring our chronic budget deficits under control. It does not appear that divided government with Republicans controlling the House and Democrats in that other House, the White House, will make this any easier. Federal government debt will, not too long from now, reach 75% of GDP. So that's not terribly high by, say, European or Japanese levels. But it's a very high debt to GDP ratio for a federal government that raises only 19% of GDP in taxes in good times. In other words, when the economy is not depressed. It means that when interest rates return to normal levels, as presumably they will one day, a fifth to a quarter of the tax take will go to debt service alone, and the fiscal outlook only darkens after that. So the question is whether the United States will come to grips with these problems before things get out of hand, or to the contrary, if it doesn't, the Fed ends up consciously or subconsciously inflating away the debt. The fact that foreigners now own a majority of U.S. Treasury securities will make the second alternative, inflating away the debt, tempting. But foreign investors understand this perfectly well. If they see the United States as unable to solve its fiscal problems, they will dump their dollars. They will try to get out of the way in advance. So to be clear, this is not my baseline scenario. The United States has shown itself capable of dealing with significant fiscal challenges, economic challenges before. It may do so again, but if it doesn't, that could spell the end of the dollar's role as an international currency. Finally, China and the challenges it must surmount in order to successfully internationalize its currency. The list of such challenges is really quite formidable when you think about them. China will have to build deep and liquid financial markets. China will have to make them accessible to foreigners. It will have to remove many of the financial restrictions that are integral to its development model. It will have to establish rule of law to give confidence to foreign investors that investing in Chinese securities big time is a prudent thing to do. So establishing rule of law, changing your development model, changing your exchange rate regime, opening your financial markets to the rest of the world, making those markets liquid, that's not, those are not things that can be completed overnight. That said, I think people are underestimating how quickly China is moving in this direction. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is that Chinese officials have set the goal of internationalizing the renminbi and making Shanghai a true international financial center by 2020. And we in the West have repeatedly underestimated their resolve in trying to achieve such goals in the past. They see allowing their own companies to set prices in their own currency and do trade settlements in their own currency, so they don't have to incur the additional cost and risk of using dollars as in their competitive advantage. They want their banks to get a larger slice of international business, the international financial pie, as well, by encouraging efforts to see that more of that business is denominated in their own currency. So as they begin to update their development model, I think internationalization of their currency is an explicit part of the strategy. The other reason I think we shouldn't underestimate them, and we should take at face value the idea that they want to transform the renminbi into a true international currency by 2020, is that history suggests that this is possible. We in the United States did exactly that between 1914 and 1924. So it's worth recalling that in 1914, the dollar played no international role whatsoever. Exactly 0.0% of global foreign exchange reserves were denominated in dollars in 1914. Exactly 0% of trade credit was denominated in dollars in 1914. U.S. exporters and importers, when they wanted trade credit, went to London, borrowed from British banks who preferred to do business in pounds sterling. So this rankled U.S. policymakers and financiers, not to mention the importers and exporters in question. So at least part of the rationale for establishing the Federal Reserve System and encouraging U.S. banks to branch abroad was to change this status quo, to give U.S. exporters and importers a competitive advantage, or at least eliminate the competitive disadvantage that they had to do business in sterling. So we established a Federal Reserve System in 1914, one whose first projects was to create a market in securitized trade credits. They weren't called CEOs, they were called trade acceptances. The Fed acted as market maker of last resort. And as more trade was denominated and financed in dollars, it became attractive for firms and commercial banks and ultimately central banks to hold their balances in dollars as well. So the history books on this subject have it wrong. They say the dollar only overtook the pound sterling as the dominant international currency after World War II. It's not true. If you look at the data, which has to be recovered from central bank archives and the like, you discover that the dollar overtook sterling as a reserve currency already by 1924. More trade was financed in dollars and in sterling already in 1924. So the circumstances between 1914 and 1924 were special. Some other factors intervened, to be sure, like World War I. But the point is that once this change gets going, it can proceed relatively quickly. And I think that's what we're now seeing in the case of China. So a year ago, no Chinese companies settled their cross-border trade in China's own currency. Now more than 70,000 Chinese companies do their cross-border settlements in renminbi. There are now, last time I counted, 43 companies, international companies, the first one of which was McDonald's, that have issued so-called dim sum bonds denominated in Chinese renminbi in Hong Kong. The Bank of China, not the People's Bank of China, but the commercial bank, the Bank of China, is now extending to you and me FDIC-insured renminbi-denominated deposit accounts. So you can go online and take one out, I think with a maximum amount of $4,000 at the moment, but I hope mine will be open here. So the point is that this process of renminbi internationalization, starting with trade finance, starting with trade settlements, moving to financial transactions like those bank accounts, and ultimately ending up with reserve currency status for the renminbi is occurring much more quickly, I think, than most people realize. So I conclude that the dollar, the euro, and the renminbi all have their problems, but the fact that there are doubts about all three of them is reason to think that there will be a place for each. So for all these reasons, I believe that a global monetary and financial system organized around multiple national currencies is coming. The question is whether we should worry about that prospect. I've already suggested that I'm not worried if we can get from here to there, but there are other people who worry about the stability properties of an international system organized around multiple national units. So some of them warn that with dollars and euros and eventually renminbi all trading in liquid markets and all being close substitutes for one another, their exchange rates will become dangerously volatile. Even a limited loss of confidence in the policies of one of the reserve currency countries would cause central banks to rush out of that currency, aggravating financial difficulties in the problem country, aggravating financial problems in the other reserve currency issuing countries as well, which would see their exchange rates go through the roof. So I think this worry is based on a mischaracterization of the behavior of central bank reserve managers. Central bank reserve managers do not act like hedge fund managers. Central bank reserve managers are not compensated like hedge fund managers. They're not compensated on a 2+20 basis. They have social responsibilities and they know it. Their principals, the governments to whom they're responsible, have longer horizons and are more patient than the typical investor in a hedge fund. They have guaranteed funding for their investments. So they can act like stabilizing speculators, is what this means. Hedge fund managers have an incentive, in many cases, to run with the financial herd. Central bank reserve managers, less so. I've talked to a bunch of them now, and they are aware of their social responsibilities. They are aware of their ability to act as contrarians. There is actually some empirical work on this because 24 central banks now publish with a lag on the IMF's website quarterly information on the currency composition of their foreign exchange portfolios. And what it shows, that data shows, is that when a currency gets beaten down, when it loses value on the foreign exchange market, central bank reserve managers tend to leap in and buy it when it's cheap to rebalance their reserve portfolios, if you will. That's evidence of stabilizing speculation. A concrete example would be the third quarter of 2010, the latest quarter for which we have data. That was a quarter over which the dollar lost some ground on foreign exchange markets. Central banks around the world bought $100 billion worth of dollar bonds, again, responding to that incentive, that desire to rebalance their portfolios and that ability to act as stabilizing speculators. What can be done in terms of policy to stabilize this multiple international currency system? It's trite to say sound and stable policies on the part of the reserve issuing countries, but it's also true to say that that would probably be the single most important thing. What would not help would be futile efforts to stabilize the exchange rates between the dollar, the euro, and the renminbi. So again, we were talking about this a little bit at lunch. The economic conditions continue to differ quite sharply between China on the one hand and the US and Europe at the moment on the other. Economic conditions will continue to differ across those major economies. So the idea that other economic policy imperatives could be credibly subordinated to the overarching objective of stabilizing the exchange rates between their currencies, I think, is unrealistic. Any such effort would quickly come apart. France has taken over the presidency of the Group of 20 for the year 2011. The French tradition is to offer far-reaching proposals for international monetary reform, generally involving schemes to stabilize exchange rates. To this end, President Sarkozy made an extremely alarming speech in August of last year to the annual assembly of French foreign ambassadors, saying we need an ambitious scheme for international monetary reform that involves stabilizing the exchange rates between the major currencies. he has been backpedaling furiously ever since. So more recent French statements have been to the effect we need to think hard about how to manage and stabilize an international system based on several national currencies. I think that's international. I think that's intellectual progress. So let me conclude. Economists are notorious messengers of doom and gloom. So I'm pleased to end on a happy note. If you buy my argument, then you should see our current international difficulties in part as a reflection of the imbalance between what is increasingly a multipolar international economy and still dollar-dominated international monetary and financial system. The good news is that this is a problem that should solve itself given sufficient time, where sufficient time, in my view, means something on the order of 5 to 10 years. 10 years from now, we will have a more multipolar international monetary system to complement our multipolar world economy. The bad news is that history tells us that financial crises occur roughly every 3 years. So 10 years is still very far away.
So we now have about 40 minutes or so for questions, and Barry will just take his own questions. If you would just please briefly introduce yourself before you raise your question.
My name is Sam Willen, and I'm a loan institute, retired now, an investor. I want to bring up two memories real quick. One in 1993 when Bill Clinton introduced his tax increase, and Bill Graham was in the well of the Senate screaming that if you think the deficits are bad now, just pass this tax increase, we're going to fall into a depression and we're going to have deficits for even longer than the eye can see. And then the next memory was in 2001 when other people, probably Graham among them, were screaming that we have a chance to pay down the debt right now. That would be a terrible idea to actually pay down the debt completely. And we have surpluses as far as the eye can see, and we need to give the money back to the people. Times change a lot. I don't think anybody in 1993 would have foreseen the discussion that happened in 2001, nor do I think many people, well, some people might have seen what was happening today after the tax cut in 2001. So what, things happen in such dramatically different ways than almost anybody actually sees. But what are the odds that in 10 years we're going to be, what kind of discussion, what kind of outlandish discussion do you think we might be having in 10 years?
Well, how to answer that provocative question. I think, what I'm in the business of doing at some level, certainly in this kind of talk and in this kind of book, is using history as a lens through which to think about the future. Your comment reminds us that the future is certain to be different than the one I'm envisaging. And I wouldn't dispute that for a moment. I would defend the value of trying to think about alternative futures and how we can shape them on the basis of what we know now. But I certainly am painfully aware of the limits of history and economic science and social science as predictive devices. So if the point of your question was make me show more caution about my predictions of the future, point taken. Is that responsive to your question?
Nobody predicted what would happen in 2001 and 1993. Nobody. I don't remember hearing one word then it would be a possibility that we could actually pay down the debt and actually return to a stable financial system within 10 years. So, I mean, what are the odds of that happening again?
Well, I think there are some things that we know with confidence. So we know demographic projections in the United States with confidence. So we know that an increasing share of the population that's elderly will have a certain impact on healthcare costs, and we know what that will imply for the fisc if we don't get our minds around that. I think our politics around that. I think we know from international comparisons that if you want to provide a social safety, and here I'm betraying my Berkeley, California politics, if you want to maintain an adequate social safety net, invest in the human capital of your population, have an adequate national defense and an adequate infrastructure, you can't raise significantly fewer taxes than any other civilized country. So I think we're going to have to, I think we do know something about the fiscal outlook in the United States, and I think we do know that we're going to have to address it on both the revenue enhancement side by figuring out how to raise more than 19% of GDP in taxes. I think we know from history that starve the beast. The idea that by cutting taxes you can automatically cut spending does not work. The empirical work that my colleagues Christy and David Romer have done shows that quite convincingly. And I think we know that we're going to have to address the health care problem, which is the principal thing that will be driving the budget deficits going forward. What else will intervene in the meantime? Your guess is better than mine.
Chief Master of Public Policy, Sanford School. My question is, what role do you see for special drawing rights in the future? And I'm assuming you don't see it as a serious contender for the dollar or the euro or the renminbi. And I was wondering why that is.
So there's another alternative international system organized around national currencies, which is some kind of supranational currency where the leading candidate would be the International Monetary Fund's accounting unit, special drawing rights. So, this is an accounting unit whose value is pegged to the value of four national currencies: the dollar, the pound sterling, the euro, and the Japanese yen, and it could be expanded to include other currencies. China's would be an obvious one. There are respectable, influential people. The Nobel laureate Joe Stiglitz, who headed up a commission to investigate these same issues on behalf of the United Nations, to suggest that something like special drawing rights. The members of the Stiglitz Commission don't like the IMF, so they suggested something like it that instead was issued by the United Nations itself might be preferable. This would be a better basis for organizing international monetary and financial affairs. And most recently, the International Monetary Fund released a big staff policy note a couple of weeks ago, suggesting steps that might be taken to enhance the role of special drawing rights in the international system. It's clear the IMF would be happy for this to occur because it's the issuer and the manager of special drawing rights. So why don't I think that will happen basically for two reasons. Number one, central banks and governments like to hold as reserves only financial instruments that are useful, that can actually be used in market intervention, finance imports and exports, in private market transactions. There are no private markets in SDRs, and creating them would be very, very difficult. That's why the IMF staff position note was 50 pages long. What would be in the IMF would have to issue SDR-denominated bonds itself. It would have to get the U.S. Treasury to issue them to begin to create liquid markets. banks would have to offer deposit accounts in SDRs to make it appealing to you to hold an SDR-denominated account. One would have to build hedging markets in SDRs. One would have to solve the coordination problems of getting lots of people doing the same thing at the same time, because the first issuer of an SDR-denominated bond would pay a novelty premium. That instrument wouldn't be liquid. All of this was tried before, if you know your history. The IMF tried to create these markets in 1980-81. Citibank offered to extend SDR-denominated deposit accounts. Nobody wanted them. It didn't work for the reasons I've been describing. It would be a very expensive effort involving a commitment on the part of lots of national governments. The U.S. government would have to commit to trying to displace the dollar as one of the leading international currencies with the SDR in order to make this happen. The other reason I don't think it will happen is that the attraction of an international currency is that it's liquid and you can get your hands on more of it in a crisis when there's a flight to liquidity. So you'll remember after Lehman Brothers that the Fed unilaterally extended these four $30 billion swaps to Mexico, Brazil, Singapore, and South Korea. It injected lots of additional dollar liquidity into international markets. Are we going to empower the International Monetary Fund to act as an international central bank and lender of last resort to provide immense amounts of international liquidity on its own volition, at its own decision, over a weekend? So, there are all these difficulties in Europe about supranationalism. Think about them on a global scale. No, I think I put it in the book. No global government means no global central bank, which means no global currency, period. So I think it's worth talking about. I can see an incremental increase in the importance of SDRs on the margin, but a system where the SDR becomes as important or more important than the leading international currencies in the international scene. No, I can't see that. So I'm way out on one end of the intellectual spectrum in terms of whether I see a role for the SDR, way out on the negative end.
Campbell Hardwick from Business School. You mentioned that you see this multipolar world in the future, but all three currencies have issues. I'm wondering if you could comment on kind of the heightened interest in real assets as an alternative, gold or other real assets, and maybe link that to August 15th, 1971.
So is that a question about gold, or that's the more sophisticated generalization of the question? My standard line about that is that I've been predicting significantly lower gold prices for 10 years, and I'll keep predicting it until I'm right. My long-standing view is that if you want inflation protection, for example, there are more efficient ways, tips and the like, in order to get it. But if you're really worried about the fiscal solvency of the leading countries in this international system, and you don't want to hold their financial assets, then you are going to look around for other things. The history of the 20th century is that central banks, for example, have been steadily reducing the share of their reserves that they hold in gold year after year after year after year, without exception, without a break, until 2 years ago, when there began to be a handful of central banks moving in the other direction. The Reserve Bank of India, Bangladesh, Russia, a couple of others that spring to mind. The gold market is too small to make much of a difference here. If you're thinking about commodities more generally, there are hedge funds and I guess there are sovereign gold funds that say, speculate in or invest in commodities, I suppose one could think about central banks doing the same, but central banks would want a very widely diversified portfolio of those because of the extreme volatility of individual commodity prices. So that's a long-winded way of saying if you don't get those sound and stable policies in the reserve currency issuing countries that I would like to see, then I would imagine a growing role for commodities. But I'm hopeful that we will instead see the other scenario. There's a gentleman right behind you.
Philip Stevens, I think last week, wrote a column you might have seen in the Financial Times about making a point that politicians on all three sides of the aisle in Britain congratulate themselves on not being part of the euro because of what's happened with Greece and so on. But he said that we haven't done an accounting of what might have happened to Britain had they been in the eurozone during the last crisis. And I wondered what your take was on that, whether it have made any difference or whether you might well have a point.
Well, you know, the criticism that people have about, one of the criticisms people have about the euro, my friend Stanley Black from UNC, who was here this morning but is not here this afternoon, makes has the criticism that the euro area has been kind of a transmission belt for instability. It has fed the massive asset bubbles and housing booms and financial excesses that we have seen in Ireland and Spain and elsewhere, and in the UK. So the UK has by no means been immune from the same problems. You know, sterling has now fallen faster than the euro since 2008 in the wake of the crisis. And the standard argument, one of the standard arguments against the euro is that it prevents adjustment through the exchange rate in response to shocks. Now we're seeing that adjustment on that margin in the UK, and time will tell whether the British economy really benefits from that or not. But would Britain be better off now if it had gone into the euro area in 1999? I don't really feel capable of answering that question. Britain is in a different position than the typical European country in the fact that it is a financial center on its own with global links, that it's always had one foot in Europe and one foot outside. So I do think it was better positioned than your typical European country to live comfortably outside the euro area. But it would be interesting to think about that counterfactual. I can't do better in terms of answering Philip Stevens' question.
Yeah, Matthias, first year Masters in International Development Policy here at Duke. And I had a question for you. If we look at the second round of quantitative easing, and we hear Bernanke, he has proclaimed that, in fact, quantitative easing was nothing else than traditional monetary policy, except that they've taken some different sort of collateral instruments. And if we, believe that this isn't traditional monetary policy, can we say that he has behaved as a hedge fund manager? And so I'd like to have your opinion on that.
This is a little bit off the topic of my book, but I cannot resist. So let me say a couple of things about it, which are a little bit contradictory with one another. So the first thing I would say is the proper way to interpret QE2 is as an insurance policy. So back toward the end of 2010, there were worries about the U.S. slipping back into inflation. Mr. Bernanke cannot decide one weekend to turn on the taps to prevent that from happening. He has to build a coalition within FOMC. So I'm sure he was looking forward to the tail risk, the low probability of a very big negative event called deflation sets in once and you can't get out. And he wanted to build a coalition that was ready to do a little bit of treasury bond buying, only $600 billion worth, but he had the coalition in place to do a lot more if it became time to actually call on the insurance policy. So I think that's what prudent central banks do. They're in the risk management business in part, and he was looking forward to the kind of risks the U.S. economy might encounter in the event we haven't encountered them. I don't think QE2 has done much damage to us, but it was there as both a bond buying program and a policy making coalition in the event that we needed it. So that's the first comment, which is thanking Mr. Bernanke for his decision and saying QE2 is a good thing. The second comment would be the Brazilian finance minister is onto something in the same way that we in the United States complain about Chinese monetary policy, monetary and exchange rate policy, because it does have cross-border repercussions. The Brazilians and the Chinese and the Koreans and others complain about U.S. monetary policy because of its cross-border repercussions. I think we do need to think about a world in which the Fed not only has a dual mandate to worry about U.S. inflation and U.S. unemployment, but it needs to think about the implications of its policies for the rest of the world. The status quo is one where the FOMC ignores those repercussions entirely. So, we insist at every G20 meeting on the importance of China internalizing better the cross-border repercussions of its policies, and then we deny completely the importance of the United States doing the same.
Donald Sassoon, Queen Mary, University of London. I like the rather laid-back attitude that you've taken to the prospect of the end of the hegemony of the dollar and the move towards a system based on at least the three currencies. Can you examine a bit more for us the impact this would have on the United States, particularly on the issue of the debt that foreigners hold, that presumably in American bonds and assets, presumably this will decrease enormously. But what sort of impact will that have on the American economy? Some people argue that it could be devastating. That, for instance, cuts in defense would be an enormous increase in unemployment and so on. Can you just explore this scenario?
So I do some back of the envelope kind of calculations in the book of how much difference would it make for the U.S. standard of living. That would be one place to start. If the dollar had to share its exorbitant privilege with these other currencies. Alternatively, how much of a difference would it make for the U.S. standard of living if the dollar lost its exorbitant privilege entirely? And the mechanisms are the kind of ones that you describe. If the dollar is not valued by foreign central banks and private investors as a store of liquidity, store of value and a liquid asset, we will have to pay them more in order to get them to absorb our treasury securities. Debt service costs will go up. They will lend to us less freely. We will not be able to run current account deficits as large as we have in the past using foreign money to finance them. We will need a lower dollar in order to be able to export more. The flat screen TV that you purchase at Best Buy will cost more as a result. So the kind of numbers I come up with are, if the dollar loses its exorbitant privilege, that would mean 3% of GDP decline. The equivalent of a decline in U.S. GDP of 3%. That's 1 year's worth of economic growth in normal times. 0 economic growth versus 3% economic growth, people would feel that 3% change in their pocketbooks. I also talk in the book about the implications for U.S. geopolitical leverage and all that. People draw the analogy between the British, French, Israeli invasion of Suez in 1956. There's that example again. And the leverage, when the U.S. threatened to sell sterling and prevent the British from borrowing from the IMF to support their exchange rate, unless Britain committed by a date certain to withdraw its troops from Suez. Could the Chinese use the leverage they have over the United States, financial leverage, to advance its own geopolitical goals? The argument I make in the book is that the two situations are quite different. China today threatening to sell its dollars if it got in a dispute, a naval dispute with the U.S. in the South China Sea or over Taiwan or whatever, would be shooting itself in the foot because those holdings are so large. In 1956, our holdings of sterling were small. The British economy was small relative to us in the United States. So we could incur a small cost that had big consequences for them and made them back down. We are, the U.S. is still, depending on what exchange rates you use to compare, 3 or 4 times the size, economic size, 3 times of China. So the two situations are, I think, quite different. There are good reasons, as we know, to worry about U.S. geopolitical leverage, but I think they have more to do with the health of the U.S. economy overall than they do with dollars exorbitant.
My name is Hashim, Masters in Economics. You outlined an outlook for the 3 currencies, and I was wondering how could the oil trade between the Gulf countries and China and the Gulf countries and Europe and the Gulf countries and the US affects the outlook of these 3 countries?
Well, so you in a way allude to the peculiar fact that, I could have mentioned this as well, that oil continues to be priced in dollars for reasons that are not self-evident. So OPEC has repeatedly over the years discussed the possibility of pricing oil in a basket. And I must admit that it totally baffles me why they have been so reluctant to move in that direction over time. I would conjecture that once China's currency, China being the big energy consumer now, increasingly, China's currency begins to move more freely against the dollar, as will happen. That will, make it uncomfortable for China, and for OPEC that oil is denominated in dollars.
My name is Frank Jones. I'm in the Transatlantic Masters program at UNC. And you touched on the problems with each of the 3 major currencies that are possible counters, and the possibility of the limitations for using a new single global currency. And you also mentioned that the technology exists for every one of us to have a currency converter in our pocket. I was wondering if you could speak to the possibility or limitations for no longer having a single currency, but rather doing all trades in whatever the native currencies are, and just going from one currency to the next between trading partners.
I thought for a moment you were going to go in a slightly different direction, which was...
Will you try that one also?
Well, let me try the one that occurred to me, and then I'll come back to the one that you were really asking about. You know, you said three currencies. These kind of lock-in effects and network effects are not as strong as they once were. If there can be three, why can't there be more than three? So you may have been asking, why can't there be 182? Because there are advantages for us when we go to international conferences. That many people know English. That there are advantages to some degree of standardization, even in this more flexible world with more interchangeability. But if you buy my argument about three, why not four or five? Nobody has asked me about the Japanese yen, which I don't think belongs in this conversation. Myself, the yen peaked in importance as a reserve currency in like 1989, and it's been down ever since. With Japan's financial problems and its dreadful economic demographic prospects and its attitude toward immigration, I don't see the Japan being one of the fast-growing dynamic economies of the early 21st century. But I do see Brazil and India as two of the fast-growing economies of the early 21st century with very favorable demographic prospects, where labor forces are going to be growing more rapidly than China's, more rapidly than Europe's, more rapidly than ours, and where financial markets are pretty well managed. I have some questions about both of them, but I could well imagine that 20 years from now, the Brazilian real and the Indian rupee will be widely used in international transactions. Brazil is in the Western Hemisphere. India is in South Asia and elsewhere.
I was wondering whether you could come back to the issue of financial crises a little bit more and talk a bit about the variation among them and the consequences thereof. You mentioned that in the next 10 years alone we have a fair chance of seeing another three. But the most recent one was in some respects quite exceptional, at least of any in halfway recent years, in having started in the United States, having been centrally a domestic crisis within the United States, that then spread out from the US. Is one of the implications of this that really most financial crises are not going to change much about the international financial system, and this was an exceptional one, so actually we, from the perspective of the stability of the international financial system, we needn't worry too much about the next three? Or maybe you can draw some of the differences that really sort of matter and some of the consequences that you see from them.
Financial crises of one sort or another are party perennial, and people who are in the business, like I once was, trying to tabulate them, count their incidents, find one every 3 years or so. They are of varying character and varying severity. The serious ones are the ones that implicate the banking system. So, that's like the cardiovascular system. It's really, of the economy is really seriously impaired. So if I understand your question correctly, it's have we begun to adequately address the problems centered on the banking system that gave rise to the most serious financial crisis in years? And my answer to that would be no, that we haven't. That the problems of excessive leverage, of post-cyclicality, of too big to fail, of international interconnectedness, not matched by any kind of international mechanism for the resolution of important cross-border financial firms. Lehman Brothers operated in 50 countries, and we have no idea about how to manage the consequences. None of those problems have been addressed. So if you're asking me, am I confident that we can avoid events as serious as the ones that occurred in 2007, 2009, again in our lifetimes? No, I'm not at all confident about that. I worry about the reform process that we have seen, where the regulated have an awful lot of influence over the process. I worry that recognition about the existence of problems, for example, the Basel Capital Accord, the capital adequacy standards, how much capital do banks need to hold? We learned at considerable expense to ourselves that the way we gauge those things was not adequate, that we have based that on two pillars. Number one, the ratings issued by the commercial credit rating agencies, and number two, the bank's own internal models. We learned that, and Dodd-Frank says we should not do that again, and it offers exactly zero ideas about what to do instead. So there will be a lot of pressure to go back to the status quo because of the absence of progress in number one, thinking about what the alternative should be, and number two, actually implementing it.
Hi, my name is Regan Lee. I'm an undergrad at Duke studying economics and engineering. So my question is, there has been a lot of currency wars, trade wars, and commodity volatility in the world recently. Do you see the possibility that the US dollar may lose its status as a world currency might intensify these trade or currency wars?
So there's one aspect of the controversy over QE2 and the idea that the Fed is in the business of pushing down the dollar. One of the worries about that is that it is giving rise to financial protectionism in a variety of other countries, which are putting taxes on portfolio capital inflows of various sorts. The fear is that this could be generalized, that it could spill over into restrictions on other forms of investment, foreign direct investment. And once governments begin to more actively manage investment, they will be more actively managing trade. That the whole process could proliferate. I don't see that any evidence of that happening so far. So I see countries like South Korea and Brazil taxing or limiting the access of foreign investors to their securities markets without interfering with these other aspects of real and financial globalization. Chinese companies are so active internationally that I think, for example, there would be pressure to the government not to interfere, except perhaps in the early financial sphere. So, serious financial problems in the United States would not be good for us. They would not be good for the world. It's clear, but I think so far anyway, management of these problems, this particular subset of problems has been relatively good.
Yes, as you mentioned with the dollar or the euro, the renminbi, again, in regards to the dollar and the renminbi, these countries have political agendas and plus they have major populations and do social programs. Why don't we use the Swiss franc? And the reason I say that is Switzerland has been neutral. They really don't have a military agenda or political agenda, and I don't see major deficits, social deficits, just like China and the U.S. are accumulating. In addition, most people trust Switzerland. As you know, if you want to do tax evasion, most of them, put their accounts in Switzerland, or a mafia, or criminal organization, dictators. So it seems like the whole world trusts Switzerland. So why don't we use the Swiss franc as a universal currency?
Because Switzerland is too small. Because debt securities denominated in Swiss francs that people trust have to be backstopped by the Swiss government. The fiscal capacity of the Swiss government ultimately is what lies behind those Swiss franc denominated securities that you and other people view as reliable and trustworthy and secure. And if the Swiss government were to launch a Ponzi scheme where it was issuing many more of them, that characteristic of the Frankfurt industry. So, you know, there are, in addition, a variety of other national currencies that people view as having desirable characteristics. Some of them, like the Canadian dollar and the Australian dollar, are commodity currencies. They co-vary in desirable ways with, say, you know, they strengthen when commodity prices go up and commodity importers need more resources. Again, the problem is that on a global scale, these countries are very, very small. So some central banks, the Russian central bank is the case that springs to my mind because their governor often makes speeches about these issues. They said, we're going to go out and buy Canadian bonds. We're going to go out and buy loonies. And the Canadians came back and said, please don't do that. Our exchange rate is strong enough already. And if there's this additional big footprint in our bond market, it's going to make life very difficult for our exports. So the point is that there is that kind of diversification occurring to an extent. It reflects the comment that was made before, that it is the advantages of diversification are there, and the disadvantages of moving away from the dollar or the dominant international currencies are weaker now than they were in the past. But it's still the case that these small countries on the fringe of the international system are still small countries on the fringe of the system. There's one in behind you.
Yeah, John Campbell, Dartmouth College. Come back to your response to the question about the fix of the financial crisis in Dodd-Frank. You listed 4 or 5 things that have not happened that need to happen. Could you prioritize those? And if there was a sequencing, because politics in the United States tends to be rather incremental, how would you sequence those reforms if, in fact, those reforms could happen? What would you do first? What would you do second?
Well, I would get serious about the things that we have said in the context of Dodd-Frank, or by saying Dodd-Frank doesn't address this because it's being addressed by the Ball Committee, and really get serious about the points that we have paid lip service to. Number one, more capital. So, you know, raising capital adequate, the capital ratio, the ratio of capital to bank liabilities from 4% to 6% or 7%. Doesn't strike me as adequate in a world where simulations done by the Bank of England suggest that adequate capital ratio for an internationally active bank is more on the order of 20%. So you may not want to go that high, even though the capital ratio has been that high, was that high over all of the 19th and much of the 20th century in this country and others. But I think there's lots of evidence that what is being done now is weak soup in terms of capital adequacy. Number two, pro-cyclicality, as I said before, that the banking system is a tremendous engine of pro-cyclicality. They ramp up their lending by turning to the wholesale markets, issuing bonds to get more resources to throw at investment. Sure. So to use regulation, capital standards to lean against that by raising capital requirements in good times during booms would be second on my list. Third would also be capital, requiring more capital of big connected banks, both to provide a disincentive against growing too big and interconnected, and also as a way of limiting the, not eliminating, but limiting the danger that the taxpayer will have to yet again come to the rescue of these institutions. Number four, worrying about liquidity as well as capital. Number 5, an adequate resolution regime for internationally active banks. That would kind of be my top 5, more or less in New York.
Hi, my name is Matt Apples. I'm from the Transatlantic Master's Program at UNC. My question is kind of two-pronged here. First, regarding Europe, many Europeans and others blame the international credit rating agencies for exacerbating the crisis in Greece and Ireland, as well as currently Portugal and Spain and other places. Do you think this is a fair criticism, first? And they also argue that the standards are applied unequally and that perhaps they should be applied more stringently to the U.S. If this was the case, how quickly would things spiral out of control in the U.S. knowing the rash herd mentality of international investors?
Well, I defer to no one in terms of my criticism of the credit rating agencies. The way I would put it is that they are perfect lagging indicators of whatever the current problem is, and therefore they aggravate this same problem of procyclicality that we were talking about before. When people think things are going good, they give AAA ratings to everything, and that enables banks to hold less capital against those assets. When things are going bad, they downgrade, and that requires everybody to deleverage after the fact. I worry about the conflicts of interest that the rating agencies had during the first half of the present decade that may or may not have been solved by Dodd-Frank, I'm not sure, where they were able to advise on the structure of securitizations and tell companies that if you do the following, you'll get a AAA rating on instruments you issue, and then they had an incentive to give it a AAA rating to the stuff that they had helped to structure. I'm not sure that problem has been entirely solved as well. I don't see any evidence that the rating agencies have been more critical of the Greeks and the Irish than they have of the United States.
I believe we should end there with the question time. Before thanking Barry Eichengreen, I wanted to point out that the Duke Bookstore has set up a table outside for anybody who might want to acquire the book, and Barry has kindly offered to sign copies thereof. With that, I would like to thank you very much for a very inspiring and interesting talk.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.